Snow screamed across the royal courtyard. The Alpha King stood above her like a storm carved into flesh and fury. And she knelt, shaking, not from fear but from what he had just said. He laughed. Cold, sharp, final. You, my Luna, don't make me laugh. Silence. The bond between them cracked, and no one saw the way her hand pressed against her stomach before she turned away, because she didn't just walk out of the palace. She walked out carrying his heir. A blizzard had not been forecast for that night, and yet, by the time the royal carriage lights faded into the distance, the sky above the Kale-Draven territory had turned white with rage. Snow struck the palace gates in violent waves, as if the land itself was reacting to what had just been declared inside those walls. Inside the great hall, silence still lingered where words had fallen too heavily to be forgotten. Her name was Lyra Vale, not born into power, not raised among the high bloodlines of the pack councils. She had come from the outer lands, where survival mattered more than titles, and where fate was not something people spoke of lightly. And yet fate had spoken for her. It had pulled her into the center of a world that did not welcome her, a world ruled by the Alpha King Kale-Draven. He was not a man who measured decisions with emotion. Every choice he made had weight, intention, and consequence. Control was not just part of his rule, it was the foundation of it. Power was expected, obedience was required, and anything that disrupted either was removed without hesitation. Lyra had learned this truth slowly, in fragments, in the way he looked past her in meetings, in the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, in the way even the air seemed to adjust itself around his presence. And yet the bond between them had insisted otherwise. It did not ask for permission. It did not wait for acceptance. It simply existed. That night, the council chamber was filled beyond its usual measure. Elders lined the long marble table, their robes heavy under the glow of suspended silver chandeliers. Shadows moved across carved pillars like silent witnesses. Lyra stood at the center, still, waiting, not because she believed this would end in her favor, but because part of her needed to hear it spoken out loud before she could accept what her instincts had already begun to feel. Kale stood above the council, unmoving. His gaze remained forward, never settling on her directly. That alone carried more weight than any accusation. Then his voice came, flat, uninterrupted. She is unworthy. A ripple passed through the chamber. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough. Enough for every elder to shift slightly in their seats. Enough for Lyra's breath to pause for half a second too long. You dare reject a fated Luna? One of the elders spoke, voice tight with disbelief. For the first time, Kale turned his head slightly, not toward Lyra, but toward the council itself, as if the question had already answered itself. I reject what weakens me. The words landed without effort, but they did not leave without consequence. Lyra felt it before she understood it, not physically at first. Something deeper, something tied to her very sense of presence in the world. The bond between them reacted instantly, invisible threads tightening, straining, resisting what had just been spoken aloud. A voice echoed inside her mind, low and fractured, like something struggling to remain intact. Mate bond destabilizing. Her fingers trembled once at her side. Only once. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in calculation, as if she was trying to understand whether this moment had been inevitable or simply delayed. Around her, the council waited for collapse, for tears, for reaction, but none came in the way they expected. Instead, Lyra exhaled slowly, measured, controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried neither pleading nor anger, only clarity. You don't have to reject me twice. The chamber did not move. Even the elders fell into silence, as if unsure whether they had heard her correctly. Kale's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted behind his eyes. A fraction, not recognition, not yet, something closer to disturbance. Lyra turned and began to walk. Each step measured, each movement was steady enough to suggest she had already accepted the outcome long before it was declared. But what no one in that room saw, that no one was prepared to notice, was the way her hand lowered briefly to her stomach as she passed beneath the archway of the chamber doors. A motion so subtle it could have been mistaken for hesitation, or fatigue, or nothing at all. Outside, the wind struck her face like an answer she had not asked for. Behind her, the palace remained lit, alive, unchanged. Inside, Khal Draven stood still among the council, watching the space she had just left behind. And for reasons he could not define, the silence that followed felt heavier than the rejection itself. No regret, not yet, just absence. And somewhere beyond the reach of the palace walls, in the cold that continued to rise with the storm, something was already beginning to take shape, quietly, unidentified to the bond that had not truly broken, only shifted into a form no one in that room yet understood. The moment she crossed beyond the palace gates, the world changed its tone. Not gradually, not gently. It was as though the territory itself had been holding its breath until she was no longer inside its boundaries. Then it exhaled. A blizzard surged through the open land beyond the palace steps, cutting visibility to fragments of white and shadow. The wind did not simply press, forced, resisted her forward movement, as if testing whether she truly intended to leave alive. Lyra Vale did not look back. Not once. Because looking back would have meant acknowledging that something inside her still expected him to call her name. But no voice came. Only distance. Only the echo of what had been said behind those silver chandeliers. Her feet struck the frozen ground unevenly at first. Controlled steps began to falter somewhere between the outer courtyard and the broken stone path leading into the forest edge. Once, she stopped. Only once. Her hand moved instinctively toward her lower abdomen, fingers pressing lightly, as if trying to confirm something only she could feel clearly. A breath escaped her lips, visible in the freezing air. "You'll survive," she whispered into the storm. "You have to." The words were not spoken to the wind. They were not spoken to fate. They were spoken to what had not yet been acknowledged by the world she was leaving behind. And then she continued walking. Behind her, the palace stood illuminated against the storm like an unshaken monument, windows glowing, towers unmoving, guards stationed like carved statues against the weather. But the light no longer reached her. Inside that structure, Khal Draven had not moved since she turned away. The council chamber was emptying slowly now. Elders retreating into quiet corridors, voices fading into procedural concern. But Khal remained exactly where he had been when the last word left her mouth. Still, controlled, silent. His gaze remained fixed on the archway she had passed through, though there was nothing left to see. Outside those doors, she was already gone. Minutes stretched in ways that did not behave like time. Then something shifted. Not in the room, not in the council, but in him. A low sound formed beneath his breath. Not spoken, not fully conscious. His wolf. Restless. Alert. Follow her. The thought did not arrive as language. It arrived as instinct. Sharp. Immediate. Certain. Kale's jaw tightened slightly. His hand flexed once at his side. Outside, beyond the palace walls, the storm continued to rise, swallowing paths, erasing direction, turning the outer lands into a shifting field of white. And somewhere within that storm she was still moving. Alone. Unprotected. Unclaimed. The wolf pressed again inside him. Harder this time. Now, a single step forward almost followed. Almost. But Khal stopped it. Not because he did not feel the pull. Not because he did not hear it. But because every instinct he had ever trusted in battle, in ruling, in survival, was built on control. And control did not bend for emotion. So he did what he had always done when something threatened to disrupt that control. He refused it. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned away from the archway. Not because she was no longer there, but because acknowledging the urge meant acknowledging what he had just allowed to happen. Outside the palace gates, Lyra disappeared deeper into the blizzard, her figure swallowed in layers of white, until even memory of her shape began to fade. And inside, Khal Draven stood unmoving in the aftermath of a decision that had not yet revealed its full cost. But somewhere beyond the reach of both palace and storm, something had already begun adjusting itself to her absence. Quiet, unseen, waiting for the moment it would no longer need silence. 3 months passed without any official record of her return. In the royal archives, her name remained listed only once beneath the designation of Luna candidate, later marked as dismissed by decree. No follow-up reports were filed. No search orders were issued under her identity. In the eyes of the court, Lyra Vale had effectively ceased to exist within the political structure of the pack. But absence, in reality, does not behave like erasure. It lingers. It settles into spaces that once held routine. And in the case of Khal Draven's rule, it began to alter the atmosphere of the entire territory. The Alpha King ruled differently after she left. Not outwardly at first. The court still convened at the same hours. The guards still rotated at the same intervals. The council still delivered reports with precision. But those closest to the throne began to notice changes that were never announced. Decisions were made faster. Punishments were issued without the usual pause for deliberation. Mercy, when it appeared at all, was inconsistent enough to unsettle even the most loyal advisors. Coldness was not new to Khal Draven, but this was different. It was not calculated. There was no interruption, as though something that once softened the edges of his authority had been removed entirely. Less patience, less tolerance, less hesitation. And yet, in the quiet hours, when the kingdom was no longer watching, something else began to surface. Not a weakness, not regret in the way stories often describe it. Something far more subtle. Displacement. It started in places no one else seemed to notice. Hallways she used to walk through. Doorways she had once paused beside. Rooms where her presence had not been loud, but consistent enough that the memory of it remained embedded in the space itself. Now those spaces felt altered. Empty corridors were still structurally identical, yet they no longer carried the same weight. Even the palace air seemed to move differently, as if adjusting to an absence it could not categorize. Khal noticed it first in movement, or rather, in the lack of it. There were moments he would reach the end of a corridor and slow down without reason, as though expecting someone to be there before logic corrected him. Moments when a door opened and, for a fraction of a second, his mind anticipated a presence that was no longer permitted to exist. At night, sleep did not come cleanly. It fractured. Fragments of memory surfaced without order. Her voice, her stillness, the way she once stood in spaces now too quiet to ignore. He dismissed it each time, not as a memory, but I am fatigued, as instability, as something temporary, because acknowledging anything else would have required a form of admission he had never been trained to make. Time, however, did not respond to dismissal. It continued forward, until the night the scent returned. It was not immediate. It was not obvious. It arrived in fragments, carried by wind that slipped through the northern perimeter of the territory during a border inspection Khal himself had ordered. He stopped mid-step. The soldiers behind him did not notice at first, but something in his posture changed. Stillness, not commanded, not intentional. His senses sharpened in a way that bypassed thought entirely. And then, it came again, faint, carried too lightly to be natural. Impossible in a territory that should have erased it completely. Khal inhaled once, slow, controlled, and for the first time in months, something inside him reacted before he could contain it. Lyra. The name did not enter his speech. It entered as recognition. His wolf stirred violently beneath his restraint. Mate. The wind shifted slightly. The scent disappeared, then returned again, just enough to confirm it had not been imagined. Khal's hand tightened at his side. His voice, when it finally came, was low, uncertain in a way no one around him had ever heard. Alive. A pause followed. Then, quieter measures, as if speaking it too loudly might collapse the certainty. Somewhere, behind him, the soldiers exchanged brief glances, unaware that the Alpha King had just crossed into a state more dangerous than anger. Because anger could be directed, controlled, used. But this was a pursuit. And somewhere far beyond the borders of the palace, beyond recorded maps and council jurisdiction, Lyra Vale continued to exist in a silence no longer complete, because something had just found her again, and this time it would not be forgotten. Far beyond the northern border, where the maps of the kingdom grew thin and the authority of the Alpha King became more theoretical than absolute, the land changed its language. The trees stood closer together. The snow did not accumulate, as if the sky itself had decided this region was meant to remain untouched for longer than memory could comfortably explain. And within a small structure built from stone, bone-dry wood, and old protective wards that had long fallen out of official use. Lyra Vale lived under a name no longer recorded anywhere that mattered. She was no longer the girl who had walked out of the palace gates 3 months earlier. That version of her had not survived the journey intact, not because the storm had broken her, but because something inside her had begun to evolve in silence long before she ever left. Now she stood in the center of a healer's hut, holding a child that should not have existed according to the laws of the Pack Council. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting shifting light across the wooden floor. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls with patient persistence, as if testing whether secrecy could truly hold in a world governed by instinct. In her arms, the child slept, small, still, and yet impossibly alive in a way that unsettled even those trained in the oldest forms of healing. A boy, with silver-gold eyes that, even in sleep, carried a faint flicker like stormlight trapped beneath water. The healer had noticed it first, not the eyes alone, the pressure in the air whenever the child cried, the way the candles dimmed slightly when he stirred, the way the forest animals outside the hut never came too close, but never truly left either. "He's strong," the healer had whispered earlier, voice careful, as though speaking too firmly might draw attention from something unseen. Too strong for his age. Lyra had not corrected her. She had not explained, because explanations required truth to be shared, and truth, in her experience, had consequences that did not always remain contained. Instead, she looked down at the child in her arms. Her grip did not tighten, but it did not loosen either. "He has to be," she said quietly, not as pride, not as fearful, as a fact, the kind of fact that does not ask permission to exist. A log shifted in the hearth behind her, sending a brief crack of light across the room. For a moment, the boy stirred. His fingers curled slightly, and the air in the hut responded, subtly, like the space itself had acknowledged something it did not yet understand. Lyra's gaze sharpened not in surprise, but in recognition. She had felt it before, not in words, not in teachings, in instinct, a presence that did not belong to ordinary inheritance. Outside the hut, the wind shifted direction, and with it came a sound that did not belong to the forest's natural rhythm, a howl, distant, low, not random, not lost, intentional. The healer froze near the corner of the room, her hand hovering near the protective markings carved into the doorway. Another howl answered, closer this time. Lyra did not move, but her expression changed. Not fear. Don't panic. Awareness. Because deep within her, something had already begun to interpret what the world outside was trying to say. They were not passing through. They were not hunting blindly. They were searching. And searches, in territories like this, were never without purpose. The child shifted again in her arms, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, as if reacting to something far beyond sleep. Lyra lowered her gaze to him, softly, almost imperceptibly. "They're closer," she murmured, not to the healer, not to the hut, but to the fragile stillness between moments. "Aren't they?" Outside, the wind pressed harder against the walls. The wards around the hut flickered faintly, responding to pressure they were not designed to withstand for extended periods. And somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the white horizon, where visibility broke apart into uncertainty, movement was gathering, not chaotic, not scattered, coordinated, as if something or someone finally narrowed the distance between rumor and certainty. Lyra adjusted her hold on the child, shifting him slightly closer to her chest, not to hide him, but to anchor him, because whatever was coming would not be deterred by silence alone. And she understood something now that she had not understood the night she left the palace. Exile does not end a bond. It only relocates its consequences. Outside, another howl rose. This one did not fade. It was held, and in the space between that sound and the quiet breath of the sleeping child, Lyra Vale finally allowed herself one clear thought. The Alpha King would eventually find her, but not as she had once been, and not as he remembered, because something had awakened in her absence, something that did not belong to the girl who once knelt in a council chamber, but to the mother who had learned, in silence and distance, what it meant to protect what the world was not meant to claim. Back at the palace, the architecture remained unchanged. Stone corridors, tall pillars, gold-lined banners, carrying the symbol of Khal Draven's rule. To any outsider, the kingdom still appeared stable, disciplined, unshaken, operating under absolute command. But within the inner council chamber, stability had begun to fracture in ways no official report could accurately describe. The long oak table, once a place of controlled debate and calculated decisions, now bore visible damage along its surface. Deep cracks spread from its center, like fault lines that had absorbed too much pressure. Khal's hand remained clenched at the edge of what was left of it, unmoving, but not calm. Across from him, the council members stood rigid, careful not to step too far forward, careful not to speak without permission that no longer felt safe to request. "You're telling me she vanished without a trace?" His voice was low, not loud, not necessary. The weight of it alone made the air in the chamber tighten. A council elder lowered his gaze. "Yes, Your Majesty." Silence followed, but this silence was different from the one that had followed her departure months earlier. That silence had been absent. This one felt like resistance. Khal did not respond immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as though measuring something that was no longer external. His wolf stirred beneath the surface of his control, not gently, not uncertainly, but with recognition that refused to be ignored any longer. Mate still alive. The thought did not arrive as intuition. It arrived as certainty that bypassed logic entirely. Khal's grip on the table tightened, would groan beneath the pressure. Then, it broke. The sound was sharp, sudden, final. Fragments of the council table collapsed outward, scattering across the floor like evidence of restraint finally losing structure. No one moved to react, not because they were unafraid, but because reacting felt like interrupting something far more dangerous than anger. Khal stepped back slightly, and for the first time in months, his balance faltered. A subtle shift, a fraction of instability in a man known for absolute control. One of the council members whispered carefully, "Your Majesty, are you certain of what you felt?" Khal did not answer immediately, because certainty was no longer the issue. The issue was recognition, and recognition was no longer avoidable. His mind moved without permission, flashing, uninvited, her standing in the council chamber, still, silent, not pleading, not resisting in the way others would expect, but final, as if she had already accepted an outcome that others were still trying to define. And then, a memory that had not carried weight at the time. Her smile, not soft, not warm, but composed, controlled, a smile that did not belong to someone waiting to be saved. Khal's jaw tightened. Something inside him shifted violently, because that memory no longer looked like submission. It looked like departure, intentional, certain. The realization did not arrive as a thought. It collapsed. Rejection should have ended it. That was the law. That was the structure. That was the balance every alpha was taught to trust. But the bond had not ended. It had only gone silent. And silence, Khal was beginning to understand, was not the same as absence. His breathing slowed, not in control, but in realization. A soundless pressure built behind his ribs, unfamiliar in a way that unsettled even his instincts. Not rage, no command, fear, not of enemies, not of rebellion, but of consequence. For the first time in his rule, Khal Draven understood something without being told. Something had been left unresolved, and whatever had been left unresolved had not stayed where it was expected to remain. The council remained frozen, waiting for instruction, waiting for order, waiting for the Alpha King to become what he had always been. But Khal did not speak, because somewhere beyond the borders of his certainty, beyond the maps, beyond the reach of his authority, Lyra Vale was no longer missing. She was continuing, and the silence between them was no longer empty. It was loaded with something that had already begun moving toward a point of collision neither of them had yet fully seen. In the northern wilds, where the forest no longer behaved like a passive landscape, but like something that listened, the night changed without warning. There was no gradual shift, no warning signs in the wind, only silence deep, unnatural, waiting. And then, it broke. Inside the small healer's hut, Lyra Vale was thrown awake by a sound that did not belong to the world as it had been moments before. A scream, not of fear alone, but of something deeper, something that carried pressure, as if reality itself had been forced to respond. The wooden walls trembled. Dust lifted from carved beams. The fire in the hearth bent sideways for a fraction of a second, as though the air itself had lost its stability. Lyra was on her feet instantly. "Aaron!" Her voice cut through the room, sharp with instinct rather than panic. She moved without hesitation, crossing the small space in a single motion, reaching the corner where the child's resting place had been prepared. But what she found was not what she expected. The boy was awake. Not simply awake, aware in a way that did not match his age, his breath uneven but not weak, his small body surrounded by a faint distortion in the air like pressure building beneath water before a storm breaks the surface. His eyes opened, and they were no longer simply silver gold. They were lit from within, not glowing like fire, but responding, as though something unseen had answered him first. Lyra stopped, mid-step. The healer behind her froze completely, hand rising instinctively toward the protective markings on the wall, but not completing the gesture. Because outside, the forest had changed posture. Wolves had gathered, not at a distance of threat, not circling, but positioned at the edge of the clearing in a formation that defied natural instinct. They were not baring teeth. They were not growling. They were still, heads lowered, bodies inclined, bowing. Lyra's breath slowed, not because she did not understand what she was seeing, but because she did, and understanding it did not make it less impossible. Her gaze returned to her son. The boy tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something beyond sound. The air around him flickered again, subtle, unstable, responsive. Lyra's hand tightened around the edge of the wooden frame beside her. A realization formed not as thought, but as recognition forced into clarity. This was not normal inheritance, not the simple continuation of alpha bloodlines, not even the rare occurrence of amplified lineage. This was something older, something that did not wait to be named before it began to influence the world around it. "He's reacting," the healer whispered, voice barely stable. Lyra did not answer, because her attention had shifted entirely to the silence outside. The wolves remained bowed, unmoving, as if awaiting permission, or acknowledgement, or command. And in that moment, Lyra understood something that settled heavily in her chest. He was not just an heir, not just a child of rejected fate and fractured bond. He was something the world had already begun responding to. A future Alpha King was a title spoken in councils and prophecies. But what stood before her was not a prophecy. It was recognition from nature itself. And recognition always came with consequence. Far away, beyond mountains, beyond territory lines, beyond the reach of maps drawn by council authority. Cale Draven stopped mid-step. The corridor around him blurred slightly, as though his body had registered something before his mind could translate it. A presence, not near, not visible, but undeniable. His breath stalled, just once. Then his wolf surged forward inside him with violent certainty. Not confusion, no doubt, but absolute recognition. "Our son is calling." The words were not spoken aloud. They struck deeper than speech. Cale's hand pressed briefly against the stone wall beside him, not for support, but for confirmation that he was still anchored in something physical. A guard nearby noticed a change. "Your Majesty." But Cale did not respond, because distance had just collapsed in a way no physical boundary could explain. Somewhere, far beyond everything he could control or command, something had awakened, and it was not waiting quietly. The change did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated, quietly, relentlessly, like pressure building beneath ice that had been trusted for too long. In the days following the distant awakening, he had felt what his wolf had named without hesitation. Cale Draven began to lose the rhythm that had once defined his rule. At first, it was subtle enough that the court chose not to speak of it. A missed meal, a delayed council response, a meeting ended earlier than usual, without explanation. But soon, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Cale stopped sleeping, not in the dramatic sense that legends would later exaggerate, but in the fragmented, shallow way that left him standing in the same place long after everyone else had left the chamber. Eyes open, mind elsewhere, listening for something that did not belong to the palace. He stopped eating properly, Meals were served, removed untouched, left to grow cold beneath ceremonial lighting that no longer carried meaning for him. And he stopped pretending. That was the part the council noticed most. Because before, even in anger, even in silence, Kale Draven had always maintained control over perception. Now, that control felt secondary, as if something deeper had taken precedence. Something older than authority, older than law. Every instinct he had ever trusted, every disciplined rule that had shaped him into an alpha king was being rewritten by a single, unavoidable truth that returned with increasing force each time he tried to ignore it. Find her. The thought was no longer a suggestion. It was a directive. Bring her back. But not as Luna. That word no longer fit within the shape of what he was beginning to understand. Not anymore. Because Luna implied placement, position, structure. What he was beginning to feel had moved beyond structure entirely. It had become something far more unstable, far more dangerous, as something that could not be categorized without consequence, as something that did not sit beneath him, but alongside him, or against him, his equal, or his downfall. The council chamber had become a place of shortened conversations. No one lingered longer than necessary. No one challenged him unless required, because the energy inside Kale Draven had shifted into something no longer predictable. Not rage, not grief, no regret, something focused, directed inward, then outward again, as if recalculating the entire shape of his world based on a single missing point. Then came the summoning. Warriors were called without formal council approval. Elite guards arrived at the inner courtyard in silence, expecting routine deployment orders, border reinforcement, or threat assessment directives. Instead, they found the Alpha King standing alone beneath the open sky. The wind moved across the courtyard without resistance. Kale did not turn when they arrived. He already knew they were there. "Your Majesty," one of them said carefully, "you summoned us." A pause followed. No hesitation, calculation. Then Kale spoke. "We leave tonight." No explanation followed. No briefing. No justification. The words did not require support. They carried their own weight. One of the warriors stepped forward slightly, uncertainty breaking through discipline. For what? The question lingered in the cold air longer than it should have. Even the wind seemed to slow. Kale finally turned, and in that moment, those closest to him understood that something in the structure of his rule had shifted permanently. His eyes were no longer simply those of an Alpha King issuing command. They were focused, not outward, but beyond, through distance, through time, through everything that had once defined control as certainty. They darkened slightly not with emotion alone, but with recognition of a path that could no longer be avoided. "For what I lost." The words were simple, but they did not sound like grief. They sounded like a decision. Behind him, the palace stood unchanged. Stone, gold, authority. But in front of him, the world no longer felt like territory to govern. It felt like something fractured, something incomplete, and somewhere far beyond those gates, beyond the reach of the kingdom's laws, beyond the safety of absence. Lyra Vale was no longer just missing. She was becoming the center of something that was beginning to pull everything else toward her. And Kale Draven, for the first time in his reign, was not preparing to rule. He was preparing to pursue it. The storm had returned with a different temperament than before. Not louder, not harsher, but denser, like the sky itself had lowered its weight onto the earth, pressing the forest into silence that felt deliberately maintained rather than naturally formed. Snow did not fall in gentle patterns. It moved sideways, fast, cutting visibility into fractured fragments of white and shadow. And yet, even in conditions like this, certain things are never truly hidden. They are simply delayed in recognition. Lyra Vale stood between the trees, still, not because she was unaware of what was approaching, but because she had already understood it long before it reached her sight. The child in her arms remained quiet, unusually so, not asleep in the ordinary sense, but calm in a way that did not match the violence of the weather around them. The forest itself seemed to hesitate. Wolves that had been present only moments ago had withdrawn into the edges of the terrain, their presence now reduced to distant pressure rather than visible movement. Not gone. Observing. Waiting. Lyra's grip on the child was steady, but not tense. Her posture did not shift when the wind changed direction. It was as if she was no longer reacting to the environment, but anticipating something that existed beyond it. And then, the trees on the far ridge parted visually through the storm. Not physically, but perceptually, as if the world itself adjusted just enough to allow recognition. Kale Draven stepped forward. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the kind of movement that suggests certainty has already replaced hesitation. Each step pressed into snow that immediately reformed behind him, erasing evidence of passage too quickly for normal tracking. He stopped. The distance between them remained, but it no longer felt like distance in the usual sense. It felt like suspension. The time between recognition and consequence had not yet decided how to resolve itself. Kale's gaze locked onto her, and the world, for a brief moment, seemed to narrow into a single point of focus. Lyra did not step back, did not adjust her stance, did not lower her eyes. She simply held the child closer, not defensively, but as confirmation of presence. Kale's expression did not change immediately, but something in his breathing did. A shift so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Not surprising, not relief. Recognition layered with something heavier, the kind of realization that does not arrive cleanly, because it carries everything that came before it, and everything that should have been different. The silence between them stretched, not empty, charged. Then Lyra spoke. "You're late." The words did not rise. They settled, like something that had already been decided long before either of them arrived at this moment. For a fraction of a second, nothing responded. Not the wind, not the forest, not even the distant movement of unseen wolves. And then, silence did not break. It shattered, not with sound, but with impact. Kale's wolf surged beneath his restraint with violent recognition, reacting not to her presence alone, but to what stood in her arms. His focus shifted downward, the child, and in that instant, something in the natural order of the encounter changed shape. Because whatever Kale Draven had expected to find, it was not this. Not her standing unbroken, not her gaze steady, and not the child that existed between them like a living consequence neither time nor distance had managed to erase. The storm behind them intensified without warning, as though the atmosphere itself had registered a transition in stakes. Kale took a single step forward, then stopped again, not because he was unsure, but because certainty had just become more complicated than distance ever was. And Lyra Valino, the girl who had once walked away from a council chamber, did not move at all, because she had not come here to be found. She had come here because what followed her had finally arrived. The wind did not fade gradually. It stopped, as if the entire forest had been cut off from motion in a single, invisible command. Snow that had been falling moments earlier hung, suspended for the briefest instant between descent and disappearance, before dropping all at once into a heavier, unnatural stillness. Even the trees seemed uncertain whether to continue moving. And then, something changed in the atmosphere itself. Not sound, not sight, recognition. Deep beneath the surface of the world, beyond packed borders, beyond mapped territory, beyond anything recorded in council archives, something ancient stirred as if disturbed from a long and patient sleep. It did not announce itself. It did not reveal the form. It only made its presence known by the absence of everything else that usually belonged to nature. No wind, no distant animal calls, no shifting of branches, just silence that felt structured rather than empty. Lyra Vale reacted first, not with fear, but with precision. Her head turned sharply toward the tree line, eyes narrowing as if trying to interpret a signal only she could partially understand. Her grip on the child tightened, but not in panic. In confirmation. "You felt that too, didn't you?" Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. Kale Draven did not answer immediately, because his body had already answered for him. His wolf was no longer restrained in the same way it had been throughout everything before this moment. It was no longer reacting to emotion. It was responding to identification. Low growl building beneath Kale's breath, not directed at Lyra, not directed at the child, but toward the unseen pressure that had just entered their reality. His stance shifted slightly, controlled, but no longer fully stable. Yes, the word came out measured, but it carried weight that even he seemed to recognize. Lyra's gaze did not leave the darkness between the trees, because the darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It had become directional, intentional, like something was standing just beyond perception, aware of being observed, but not yet willing to be seen. The child in her arms moved for the first time since Cale's arrival, not restlessly, not in distress, but with awareness that did not match age or understanding. His head turned slowly toward the same direction, and then he smiled, not the simple reflex of infancy, not comfort, not innocent, recognition. Cale noticed it instantly. His entire focus shifted downward. The reaction inside him was immediate and violent in its implication, because instinct did not mistake that expression. Something had just been acknowledged by the child that neither Alpha nor Luna had yet fully understood. Lyra's voice dropped even lower. Aaron. But she did not finish the name, because the forest answered first. A pressure wave moved through the tree line, not physical, but perceptual, like reality itself had briefly adjusted its alignment. And then the child spoke, for the first time. Clear, small, but absolutely. They're coming for me. Silence did not follow. Silence collapsed. Lyra's entire posture tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with confirmation. Cale stepped forward instinctively. One movement, not planned, not ordered, pure reaction. And in that same instant, the sky broke. Lightning did not strike randomly. It split directly above them, carving a white fracture through the stormless sky, as if something above had been forced open from the inside. The sound did not arrive immediately. It came after, delayed, like the world itself had needed time to process what had just occurred. The forest lit in harsh fragments of light, revealing not clarity but interruption. Shadows of trees that seemed briefly misaligned, contours that did not hold shape consistently. And beyond it all, that presence, still not visible, but no longer deniable. Lyra held the child closer. Cale did not retreat. Neither of them spoke, because whatever was approaching was not part of the conflict they had been living through. It did not belong to Alpha authority. It did not belong to the Luna lineage. It did not belong to pack history at all. It belonged to something older than both. And in the space between lightning and silence, one truth became unavoidable. The reunion did not end with a story. It had opened one.